Okay, well, good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on your time zone, of course. My name is Will Overend. I'm a consultant with the Decentralized Energy Canada team. I'll be your moderator today. I'd like to extend a big warm welcome to you for attending what we were calling the Export Primer and what we're now calling the Trade Orientation Session. Today's program is part of a one-year program to accelerate collaboration and trade between Canada and the Caribbean, specifically related to microgrids. And you'll hear a little bit more about the program later from Anouk. I want to let you know that this session is being recorded. You will be muted automatically on entry. You're welcome to unmute at any of the Q&A sessions this morning, of course. You're welcome to leave your camera on or off as you so please. Because I'm connecting to you from Calgary today, I would like to convey that we acknowledge and greatly value the fact that we live, work, and play on the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, Siksika, Kainai, and Piikani, the Tsuut'ina and the Stoney Nakoda nations, as well as the homelands of the Métis Nation Region 3, and indeed all the people who make their homes in Treaty 7 region of Southern Alberta. We have quite a lineup of speakers today. Each is a specialist in their respective area concerning microgrid trade between Canada and the Caribbean. The presentations will be available afterwards, so no need to take copious notes. Some of you completed the needs survey leading up to this session, and your aggregated answers have been provided to our lineup so they can better understand your specific challenges. There will be opportunities, of course, during the session for Q&A. And you can increase the chances that your question is addressed, of course, if you get it into the chat box here on Zoom early. I'll be trying to monitor the chat box along with help from Crystal. We do have some follow-up from this session to provide to you. And if any questions are left unanswered at the end of the session, we'll make all attempts, of course, to get back to you with relevant information. Now it's over to Anouk. Anouk Kendall is the president of the Decentralized Energy Canada. Anouk has spent the better part of 2 decades connecting and advancing the DE community in Canada and well beyond Canada. Particularly in the last few years, DEC has achieved rising success as the sector, including microgrids, takes flight. The Rocky Mountain Institute, which is a partner in the delivery of this program, describes Anouk as a big-time playmaker across Canada in our space. And I'm very proud to have a connection with Anouk. She's coming to you today from the DEC offices in Calgary, and she'd like to take about 10 minutes of your time right now to introduce things. Anouk?
That was awesome. Thank you, Will. Yeah, that actually is a great little opener. I was going to start with the Decentralized Energy Canada, who we are and what we do. And thanks so much for that, Will. Excited about today. This is our second Canada Caribbean program in 3 years. And we've always been quite focused on microgrids for a number of reasons, which you'll learn more about today. But very thankful for our partnership with the Rocky Mountain Institute and Global Affairs Canada. This program is supported by CanExport through their funding. And so just very briefly, Decentralized Energy Canada is a national not-for-profit industry association. We're not a typical industry association because we receive $0 of government core funding. We've never had core funding from government. We are largely private sector funded. So industry memberships, events, industry provides us with funding to help with knowledge and expertise and data, etc. And we do government programs, but they're programming. They have deliverables like this one. There is specific work to do and deliverables. So it's very unusual for an industry association not to get that government core funding. And I believe it makes us stronger and more resilient when things happen in the world. You've got other ways to make up for any falls in funding. We are national. We cover Canada. We have members in 60% of Canada's provinces and territories, but we're also largely an international market access hub. And I would say that's because of a need to be international. there's no greater way to speed up progress than through international collaboration and figuring out what's going on in other countries of the world for various different reasons. And Canada is really not, we have our challenges, and we have challenges that are growing and getting more urgent, but there are other countries of the world. We've done work with Nigeria, the United Kingdom, Germany, the Netherlands, the Caribbean. They all have much more urgent needs for the energy transition. So by having a large international network and staying close and collaborative with our international partners, we are seeing greater progress at a faster rate, I believe. So this program, the Canada Caribbean Microgrid Trade Accelerator, is intended to bring Canadian microgrid solution providers closer to Caribbean microgrid opportunities. So the program started with a market overview, so a microgrid market overview report for 2023 in the Caribbean, which will be published shortly, along with a very short video that gives a very high level educational video on the opportunity of microgrids and the energy situation in the Caribbean. It goes through things like the snapshot of energy, what are the rising costs and the consequences of natural disasters, talks about what is driving microgrids in island communities and all of the world, to be quite honest, and talks about some of the, disjointed regulations and the investment climate and how it's changing. And then we have some case studies of microgrids, largely case studies that have been supported by the Rocky Mountain Institute. So when that is ready, you are all on our mailing list, and we will send you that report when it is published and the video that goes along with it. We had our B2B matchmaking session yesterday, where we had about 26 companies attend and get to know each other from the Caribbean and Canada as a soft introduction. And these soft introductions virtually done are good because you can see who are not the tire kickers. These are people that have a genuine interest in collaborating and working together. So quite happy with how yesterday went. Some valuable discussion, met some great new people in the Caribbean, and we're able to match them with some high quality companies in Canada. Today is our trade orientation webinar. And then we will be selecting 8 Caribbean companies to get partially subsidized to come to Canada, Chateau Lake Louise, in November 6th and 7th for our Decentralized Energy Forum. Looking forward to hosting these companies in Canada and strengthening the relationships there. And then in March 2024, we will have a trade mission of 10 Canadian companies selected to go to the Caribbean. We haven't decided which island or the exact dates in March, but we will keep all of you apprised of that. And so an exciting program. And today we're going to talk a little bit about the different things going on with the Government of Canada, Export Development Canada, the Rocky Mountain Institute, the Caribbean Alliance for Sustainable Tourism. And then we're going to have a bit of a mini workshop with Nancy Ferran on ESG value proposition. So with that, I think that's great. Will, did you want to do an intro?
Sure.
Okay, super. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Annette, for starting things off. It's my honor to introduce Claudia Gutierrez. Claudia is the Regional Trade Commissioner for Sustainable Technologies at the Canadian Embassy in Colombia. Claudia, you're a business development professional. You have at least 2 decades, I believe, of experience in supporting foreign companies, helping them to gain a foothold in the Caribbean and the South American markets. Claudia, you're connecting from Bogota today, sorry. And we welcome the next 10 minutes to learn about the Trade Commissioner Service, its presence in the region, and the services you may be able to take advantage of, at least the participants on this may be able to take advantage of. Claudia.
Thank you, Will, for the introduction, and thank you, everybody, for being here. I know the audience is a mix between Canadian companies and Caribbean ones, so I will present our services, the services of the Trade Commissioner Service, addressed to both audiences. So let's start. Crystal, I think you're managing the presentation, so exactly. Let's start with who we are, who is the Trade Commissioner Service, why do business in Canada, and then some Canadian capabilities in the energy sector in very general aspect. Next. So let's start by telling you who we are. So our network is a network of international trade professionals. We are around the world in more than 160 locations, including our network in Canada, our regional offices. Next, please. Our regional offices usually are the initial and the main point of contact for our Canadian companies that are willing to expand internationally. So we have offices in the Atlantic region, Quebec, Ontario, in the Maritimes, BC as well. So the idea is that if you are willing to go international, you approach these trade commissioners in those offices to present your plan. They will help you to shape it up and to connect with all the TCs worldwide. So you can connect with them also to know what are the activities organized by the Trade Commissioner Service, and they can easily provide information on specific regions and connect you with trade commissioners in the world. Next, please. So what's our presence in Latin America? So I'm currently covering Latin America and the Caribbean. We represent 21 offices covering 44 territories, countries and territories. So you see in the map that we have extent presence in the Caribbean. So if you are targeting a specific island or specific country there, and you don't know yet who you should connect, you can approach me and I will be more than happy to make that linkage with the trade commissioner in the territory. Sometimes there is not a trade commissioner in the specific country you are targeting, but for certainly we will have somebody nearby that is covering that area. We can help you to identify opportunities, to connect with the right people, the local partners, and in that way you will save time. You will know your risks and will be able to manage those risks of going international. Next, please. In terms of the why doing business with Canada and the support we can provide to the local contacts, so in this case, the Caribbean entities that are joining us today. Next, please. We can help you also to connect with those Canadian companies that have approached us and that are ready to go internationally. So we can help you in 3 areas. So innovate, investment, and supply or buy from Canada. So in those different areas, our main role will be to connect you and identify the good contacts and the best contacts for you. Innovate with Canada, we have a network of research institutions and research entities that can help you and that you can partner with to develop different projects, to develop products and services, or to adapt the ones that already exist for your specific conditions. Investment, if you want to have a manufacturing plant or a research center in Canada, we can help you with that. And the most common one is buying from Canada, procuring from Canada. So in that sense, we can help you based on your needs to identify the best providers for you, reliable companies that are already selling internationally, that have proven technologies for the different types of challenges that you are facing. Next, please. Having said that, we have some strengths in clean tech, and since we are approaching the energy sector, that's within the energy, within the clean tech umbrella, clean tech and infrastructure. So we have various solutions for the energy sector. And it's important for you to know that Canada has a dynamic economy towards clean tech solutions that are ready to go internationally. We have also free trade agreements signed with various countries that you can benefit from. Next, please. Within the areas that we cover, and you will find that we are covering various industries, such as energy, as I mentioned before, mining, transportation, agriculture, various industries as well. And you will find Canadian solutions in the whole value chain of those industries. Next. Some of the technologies or the areas in which Canada excels are renewable energy, water and wastewater, energy storage. We have capabilities in hydrogen and fuel cell, not just green hydrogen, but in the hydrogen and the use as a fuel from the various years. Energy efficiency, smart grids, carbon capture, utilization and storage, and waste to value. Next, please. So since we're talking about microgrids, I will present you very broadly the capabilities in the energy sector. The idea for our Caribbean attendees is to have a better idea and an example of the opportunities or the strengths, the capabilities that Canada can offer. And again, based on your specific needs, we can help you to identify the best providers for those or partners for those solutions. Next, please. So we have renewable energy. So as I mentioned before, Canada has a dynamic economy that uses various types of various sources for energy generation, has a very a good mix of energy in its matrix. So 82% of the electricity it's coming from non-emitting sources. So we have capabilities in wind, in solar, in tidal energy, and to be able to support these projects and the generation from these renewable sources. Next, please. We have also capabilities, and we must have capabilities in energy storage. That's key for being able to develop and for securing the supply of energy coming from renewable sources and for providing the energy to rural areas as well. So I think that's part of what we're looking for regions like the Caribbean that are not necessarily connected through the transmission lines, for example. So we have developed solutions for both, for generation, but also for the energy storage. And tied to that, next please, we have also capabilities in energy efficiency and smart grids to make the most use of the energy that we are generating from different sources in the different and to face the challenges that that come from generating in rural areas and non-connected areas. Next, please. So in terms of smart grids, for example, that's another area that we have developed quite well in Canada. We have developed technologies for smart metering. We have technologies on EV charging as well. So as you can see, there is a good portfolio of solutions that we can offer. It's a matter of identify the specific needs for your territories or for your projects to find the best partner, the best Canadian technology that would serve to solve those challenges or specific projects that you may have. Next, please. So with that, I thank you all for your attention today, for being here today. And as I mentioned before, if you don't know yet who will be your trade commissioner in the territory you are located, please contact me. I'll be more than happy to make that connection.
Great, thank you, Claudia. Strikes me that Canada is an excellent proving ground for the application of technologies in the Caribbean. Seems like there's so many similarities aside from temperature, of course. There's this idea of province by province here, where the regulatory and the energy mix is different. And in the Caribbean, you've got, of course, the island states, each with different views and different strengths. So it's great to see this sort of as a connection. And thank you, Claudia, for taking the time. Also, yesterday, thank you for serving as facilitator in the B2B session. Much appreciated.
My pleasure. Thank you for the invitation.
We'll switch lanes now slightly and we're going to have a Q&A in a few minutes, but want to hear first from Tamara Fatih. Many of us know about EDC, but few of us have ever used it. Tamara is the chief representative in the Andean region, Central America, and the Caribbean at Export Development Canada, or EDC. Tamara plans to take about the next 10 minutes or so explaining EDC to you and showing how you could take advantage of its services in removing some of the risk from your ventures into the Caribbean region. After that, we will pause to address any questions that have accumulated in the chat box and have a bit of a Q&A session for a few minutes. So if you do have anything of curiosity right now from Claudia's or Anouk's presentations, please log it into the chat box. And Tamara, would you're connecting normally from Bogota, but you're from, you're in Ottawa today?
Yes, thanks so much, Will. And it's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you for including me and including EDC. I am in Ottawa visiting my mom and my nephews, my brother, and then heading back to Bogota next Thursday. So yes, normally I am based in Colombia, just like Claudia. Our offices are quite close to each other. And yeah, but today, happy to be on Canadian soil. So thank you so much. As I said, I'll give a bit of a brief overview of EDC, some of our products that could be of interest. So next slide, please, Crystal. Thank you. So EDC is, for those of you who aren't familiar, we're Canada's export credit agency. We've been around for over 75 years. We're self-sustaining, and effectively we're here to help Canadian companies grow and succeed internationally. Next, please. So really we're here for trade impact. We're trying to make Canada and the world better through trade. That's one of our taglines. And we're really all about providing trade knowledge, solutions, whether it be financial or insurance solutions, there to help Canadian companies enhance their competitiveness and compete really on the international stage. Next, please. So one of our core focuses is ESG, and we really believe in the power of ESG to harness global business and be an accelerator for global businesses. So everything we do, we embed ESG in it. And we really try to work with Canadian companies to ensure that they're also adhering to sound ESG practices. And our international companies that we support as well, we always want to work with them and advise on ESG practices. Next slide, please. So this is what we like to call our ecosystem. So EDC, we work very closely with the Trade Commissioner Service. So I work very closely with Claudia and the team in Bogota and also across the Caribbean, Andean and Central America. And we also work with CCC, with the Canadian Commercial Corporation and the Business Development Bank of Canada. Next, please. So we're all about, I mean, when I was looking at Claudia's presentation, it's pretty impressive. They certainly have far more offices than we do, but we have offices across Canada, and here you're seeing our international representations. We actually have another 3 that have just been added, and we're going to be continuing to grow. But for today's purposes, I think the most important is Bogota, where we support the Caribbean as well. Next, please. So here's the slide where I'm going to spend a little bit more time. So I want to speak to you about the various solutions that we offer, whether it be financing, insurance, knowledge, or connections. So I think most normally the companies come to us and start with our insurance products. And that's really how we can help mitigate risk for Canadian companies as they take on their first credit contract internationally. So our credit insurance covers 90% of companies' insured losses against the risk of non-payment that could be as a result of a customer's inability to pay. It could also be as a result of political instability or sudden contract cancellation. Our team of insurance specialists effectively are here to support the Canadian companies from the moment that a Canadian company considers a new customer or gets a contract internationally until you get paid. Our insurance coverage is quite flexible and can be available for a single customer, or actually can be for an entire book of receivables. for all international affiliates. It can also be used to offer customers better payment terms and to free up bank operating lines by providing insurance as collateral. What we find, we do a lot of work and partnering with Canadian financial institutions, and companies will get access normally to 90% versus 70% when their receivables are insured, when we're talking access on their line of credit. So we see that as a great working capital solution. Moving over to financing, this is something that for both the Canadian companies that are on the line, as well as for our Caribbean companies joining, we provide buyer financing. So if there is a contract that the Canadian company has won and the international company based in the Caribbean would require financing, that's something that we can work with. We also, depending on the size of the contract, we can either work with Canadian financial institution partners, such as Elevate Capital, or provide direct buyer financing. We also, if it's a much larger, we do everything from small to project finance. So we've been in the Caribbean, we've done quite a bit in terms of project financing not necessarily in the energy space yet, but in terms of infrastructure projects as well. And then I want to focus a little bit as well on our knowledge products. So we'd like to bring the expertise and knowledge that we have from the markets back to Canada, so that Canadian companies can access, whether it's on our Export Help Hub, where you can look up if you have questions in particular on a particular market, or just by reaching out to myself or my team, we can help with answering questions related to the market. And then our connection financing program, which is a more specialized program. It's not something actually that we're presently involved in the Caribbean, but hopefully perhaps in the future. But that's a financing product that we work with international buyers, usually multinationals, and then introduce Canadian companies into their procurement and supply chain. Next slide, please. So this is just a snapshot of the business volume in 2022. We did $1.8 billion of volume on the financing side, or in total volume, sorry, and 16 million in financing, and served over 400 customers. And you can see the breakdown by sector, whether it was extractive or resources, transportation, but the big ones being infrastructure and environment and extractive. And as you can see, the majority of the business volume that we do is actually on our insurance side. And that's, most companies, when they start working with EDC, usually with our knowledge products, but then insurance, because you want that security and trying to alleviate and mitigate the risk that you have with perhaps working internationally with the first contract with a new buyer. Next, please. And these are just a few samples of some financing transactions that we did in 2022 within the Caribbean region. Next. And so here, my team, you can always feel free to reach out to myself or any of my team members. We're all based in Bogota, but responsible for the Caribbean as well. So thank you so much. And I look forward to your questions.
Thanks so much, Tamara. That was awesome. Yeah, there's a question for you and a general comment that I think we should perhaps start with. I would invite any of you to just unmute yourself and ask any questions you may have of Anouk or Tamara or Claudia at this time. And we have a few minutes to discuss these things. But first of all, Anouk, you wanted to, I think, specify the definition of microgrid. I know there's a lot of interest in microgrid, and there's references to interconnected and off-grid, great benefit in parts of the Caribbean. Can you comment on the definition that you're using?
Yeah, and I just I put it in the chat there so that people can see that we've just finished some work with Standards Council of Canada and the CSA group on developing a national technical specification on terminology, which is critical because the terms that are being used in the decentralized energy space are very, very different. A lot of new ones, you know, battery to grid, vehicle to grid, nanogrids, microgrids, mini grids, prosumers. And I think a lot of our delays in progress come from a lack of understanding of the new terminology when a rapid transformation takes place in industry. So we are doing our part to try and build industry consensus around those terminologies. And it takes time because when you're in standards development, people want the industry consensus and then they want to double down on that validation and that consensus building process. So it takes some time, but DEC doesn't have to do that. So we keep throwing out these terms and saying, you know, these are the globally accepted definitions for them. And then we feed them into standards development organizations to make them into a national technical specification. So I wanted to be clear that what we're talking about, when we talk about smart grids, that's a bigger picture. It covers transmission and distribution. Underneath the smart grid umbrella is microgrids, mini grids, and nanogrids. And microgrids have a defined boundary, whether that's a community or like a hospital, a university campus, a community. You have a defined boundary with multiple loads, consumers within that. And within that boundary, you have solar, battery, natural gas combined heat and power, energy sources within that boundary that are supporting those loads. But the thing about microgrids is it can either it has to be connected to the transmission infrastructure, but it also has to be able to disconnect when needed. So when a storm has affected the larger grid and you need to isolate your community or your hospital and make sure that your energy is still running during that storm or that outage of the bigger grid, that is the main premise behind a microgrid. Is it's called islanding or working autonomously from the grid, or you can connect back. And there's economic, environmental, and technical reasons why you would operate differently at different times. So sorry, that I wanted to clarify that at first.
Yeah, thanks, Anouk. And that's particularly valid in terms of the Caribbean, where the terminology can vary from island to island. And it's of interest, I guess, to harmonize if possible. I see that I'm going to just throw a couple of questions out for Tamara, and I know Andrea has a question. So I'll just pass this over to you, Tamara. Which countries?
Thanks.
Yeah, you've seen that, eh? Which
I can see it. Yeah, I pulled up the chat. Thank you, Andrea, for your question related to which countries in the Caribbean are not supported by EDC. So we are open to business for, I believe, all countries in the Caribbean. That being said, the most up-to-date is always on our website, and you can see whether we're open on a restricted basis, open completely, or closed. The only countries, I think, in the world that we are closed to business to are Russia and North Korea. So we're pretty much open to business in almost all countries globally. And really, we look at transactions on a transaction by transaction basis. So even if it is in a country that would be perhaps more on a restricted basis, that doesn't mean that it would not get supported.
Yeah, thanks for that. I just wanted to follow up because we've had experience with issues with shipping to Cuba, and we were told that any products that are on the American Stock Exchange are not allowed to be shipped to said country. So that created a lot of issues. So I was just wondering if EDC had some ways to work around that you knew about that perhaps you could help with.
So if a product is not permitted to be shipped to Cuba, then chances are there's nothing that
you can do about it.
If it's a Cuba regulation, then that's not something
it's not a Cuba one. It had more to do with the embargo.
Oh, from the US?
Yeah.
Is it possible then to ship it from a different location rather than the United States?
If it's a product, it has nothing to do with that. It has to do with being traded on the American Stock Exchange. So if you have any products that are traded on the American Stock Exchange, you're not allowed to import those products. And so then our suppliers or vendors they just pull back. And we've had problems working even with EDC or BDC about
Yeah.
these things. So I was just wondering if you had a workaround or knew about this issue.
No, and actually, of all the countries in the Caribbean, the one I do not support is Cuba. It's actually out of our Mexico office. So I'd be happy to put you in contact with our person there who maybe has more experience. But I do know that we do like the accounts receivable insurance product is effectively the one and only product that we have that's utilized for companies that are exporting to Cuba. But happy to connect you with our person who actually covers Cuba. So I probably should have said that at the beginning, that it's everything in the Caribbean except Cuba.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Yeah. No. Perfect. That's why I put that question out there. Always need to
Yeah.
clarify that one.
Yeah.
And then my other comment just had to do around microgrids. To Anouk's point about definition, super important. However, microgrids do not need to be connected to a distribution, transmission or distribution network to be a microgrid. So I'm really curious to find out if that's part of just an interpretation or part of actually a definition that's coming out, in just as being one of the people who has worked in that field forever. And
Sure.
then can microgrids be used to remove peak loads and the main grid? Just because I'm talking, I figure I could say yes, but I'll leave that for someone else to answer. Thanks so much.
Okay, let's go to Anouk and then maybe get back to you tomorrow.
I think I missed the point there. And maybe what I should have said is that microgrids that is a globally adopted definition, which the CSA group did include in the National Technical Specification, but they have not included mini grids and nanogrids yet because those are still too new for a standards development organization to put into their thing. So mini grids and nanogrids are not connected to the larger grid, and mini grid has multiple loads but not connected to the larger grid, and a nanogrid is within one building. And
Right.
that might, I can't see why that would change. It's been used for over a decade, that the definition for those two, but you never know.
Anouk, while we're still with you, can you comment on the notion of microgrids being used to remove peak loads from the main grid?
Oh, right. Sorry. And I thought I missed something else from Andrea there. Yeah. Peak shaving for sure. And that's a whole big topic. And Andrea covered that, I think, part of that in last year's microgrid panel in Ottawa. But yeah, the use of microgrids, the use of battery to grid, all of these systems that you can, and we've got Brad Mains on the call too, formerly from Medicine Hat, where congestion is an issue in lines, microgrids can help flatten out the peaks, reduce congestion, and overall improve the overall performance of your grid and the economics of it. So yes, thank you, Andrea. I know I kind of missed something important in there.
Yeah, thank you. And then Tamara, a little follow-up for you. I guess the idea of buyer finances would be quite popular in the Caribbean. So I wondered if you could sort of spend a few moments talking about how to mobilize or access that.
Yeah, for sure. So buyer financing. So one thing I should have stipulated up front. So EDC operates on market principles. And so we do not offer grants. We do equity investments in Canadian companies, very much focused on clean tech, women in trade, and also Indigenous and Black owned businesses. In terms of buyer financing, it would be in either a loan in the form of a loan, or it could be in the form of a guarantee, which we would provide to the Canadian financial institution. Usually our partner institution that we work with on the buyer financing side is Elevate Capital. So Elevate would be the one that would provide the loan to the Caribbean company that would be purchasing equipment from a product or service from the Canadian entity. And then we would actually provide a guarantee up to the loan to value ratio of 85% to Elevate Capital, so that this way they would be covered, but in case of non-payment. But that is effectively how our buyer financing program on the guarantee side works. And then if it's a larger than $25 million, we would do direct lend. And again, it's not in the form of a grant, but directly in the form of a loan. And you would be getting the same type of pricing structure with us that you would get with any financial institution.
Great. Okay. Thanks, Tamara. It's, hopefully, Sapphire, that addresses some part of your question, and you can certainly hook up afterwards too to get more clarification there and discuss more sources. We're just about done with the Q&A session. If it's all right with you, we'll move to the next speaker. I take it David Gums is on somewhere today, and I see his presentation up, so that is awesome. David is the director of the Rocky Mountain Institute Islands Energy Program. He's a clean energy enthusiast committed to building a better future for islands communities through expanding access to resilient, renewable energy. And he's in the process right now of delivering financial advisory, project management, business development, and renewable energy solutions to his partners, the RMI's partners in the Caribbean. He is going to occupy about 18, 17, 19 minutes of your time, something like that, to help us all, I guess, to paint the picture of the Caribbean sustainable and green energy picture for you. We'll follow his talk with a short Q&A, so don't forget about those chat boxes. And David, you're on. Are you connecting from Washington today?
Yes, I am. I would have much preferred to connect from Anguilla, but so is life, such is life. Yeah.
Welcome. Welcome.
All right, thank you guys so much. Pleasure to be here today and talk a little bit about the Rocky Mountain Institute, RMI, program, and specifically the Islands program, a little bit of the work we do. If you don't mind flipping to the next slide, please. Yeah, so just a little bit about RMI for those who may not be as familiar. We're independent global nonprofit, essentially with a goal of accelerating the transition to clean energy. And the main purpose of that, of course, is to combat climate change and the impact in particular, personally for me, on the Caribbean in Anguilla, which is essentially at ground zero. So there's a little bit of a personal interest in doing the work that I do, but it's also excitement. There's so many other benefits that this type of work brings to a country, region, and the world. So it's really exciting stuff for me to be part of. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, islands are, at ground zero of the climate change. And this means that every year, and just 2 weeks ago, we had a hurricane head our way. There's another one brewing in the Atlantic that is heading towards the Caribbean. And essentially what that means is, every time a storm gathers off the coast of West Africa, everyone in the Caribbean is anxious and thinking about who is it going to hit. And if you have 30 islands, or there are hundreds of islands, but 30 countries, spread from north to south, it's like, who's going to get it? It's like Russian roulette. Who's going to get hit this year? Or how many of us are going to get hit this year? So it really is an agonizing time for property owners and just people living in the Caribbean. Yep, one more. You can go to the next slide. Yeah. Another reason, energy in the Caribbean is incredibly expensive. Actually, if you don't mind flipping one slide back to the chart. Yes, incredibly expensive in the Caribbean. At its height, it could be at 60, 70 cents per kilowatt hour. And on average in the US, it's usually the benchmark we use, it's high at 15 cents per kilowatt hour. Here in Maryland, it's about 11 cents, 13 cents per kilowatt hour. So it's incredibly expensive. And as you can imagine, that impacts every aspect of life for folks living in these countries. So apologies.
David, you need to, there you go.
I apologize. That means that every aspect of life is impacted, from children who have to use light for reading at night to the average person who has to use AC for comfortable living. Next slide, please. So we approach this from the lens of using three things, three criteria. One is energy equity. The second is energy resilience, and you can see with that many hurricanes why it's important. And then looking at the impact on climate and doing our part. I'll dig in a little bit into these different approaches. Next slide, please. So energy resilience, we were talking a little bit about microgrids, nanogrids, and the like. We take a approach of using the distributed energy infrastructure to build resilience. So today, you pick the Caribbean island, there are very few centralized fossil fuel plants for the most part. There are very few who have a very distributed system. And in most islands, one centralized plant or two. And what that means is that you have a distribution network running for miles, in some cases, hundreds of miles across different parts of the island. And if there's a storm, all that damage has to be repaired for 100 miles. And that usually, or can take, I should say, a year in the worst case scenarios, like in the Bahamas, in some communities. And on average, it takes about 3 months. In Anguilla's particular most recent case in 2017 with Hurricane Irma, as the CEO of the Anguilla Electricity Company, it took us 100 days, almost exactly, to get back power to the last community. And that is devastating for the economy and devastating for people. Imagine living under those hot conditions post-hurricane with no electricity, no refrigeration, no air, no AC. It's not a very comfortable living. And many of us depend on tourism. So there you go again, it has a significant impact on hotels' ability to operate, and therefore tourism is significantly impacted. So there are many, many benefits that come through this work, centralizing, moving from a centralized to distributed system, from fossil fuel to renewables, which is less expensive. And of course, you're no longer importing and having that sort of dependency on imported fossil fuel. You now generate your electricity locally and all the benefits that come with that. Next slide, please. But there's a challenge, and the challenge is partly what I described, the impact of climate change, more frequent hurricanes, stronger hurricanes, more damage, more economic impact. In some countries, it takes, in the case of Dominica or even Anguilla, we spent 1.5 times our annual GDP recovering from Hurricane Irma. Dominica with Hurricane Maria spent 2 to 2.5 times their GDP in the recovery. You can imagine how many years that sets back a country in terms of its development stage, and countries that are already challenged. So you're talking about an impact that stretches over a 10 to 15-year period in terms of developmental impact. So with that said, it's very important, but that brings another host of challenges, right? Already you're talking about communities with small scale in terms of the energy capacity, and you're talking about low number of people. So people capacity is also a challenge, but it's just sort of perpetuates a problem and creates more and more challenges that we have to overcome. Next slide, please. So there's this sort of daunting statistic. 90% of the energy projects in the Caribbean fail at the project preparation stage. And that's where we come in. This is where we try to bring value to the table and basically build in projects, or actually from concept to commissioning, we bring extra additional capacity to making these projects happen. So we're bringing new approaches to the design of the electricity grid. We're also bringing sort of the capacity to make projects bankable and push them through the system. Next slide, please. We feel the recent Caribbean Climate Smart Fund that we established is the solution that helps us to alleviate or combat all of the challenges that you face in this process. Bring in the appropriate finance into the table, both on the investment side and the project preparation side. We use a combination of loans and philanthropic fund capacity to the table, where we basically use and take out the high risk part of the project development phase, and that is project preparation. So the amount of resources and capacity that it takes to do the project preparation isn't typically available. We come in and add that additional resource. That gets you more bankable projects. That gets you all the benefits that we talked about earlier. Next slide, please. And it comes back to, what does that mean? Energy equity, energy resilience, and impact on climate. Low emissions, and countries are able to meet their NDC targets. I think access to funds, lower cost, distributed, resilient, all those things you're already familiar with and I already spoke about. Next slide, please. Here's an example of one of the projects. This is in the Ragged Island, part of the Bahamas chain of islands. It's far to the south, got impacted by Hurricane Irma. The island essentially had to be evacuated. There were a few residents who refused to do so. And when people went back home, they dealt with a situation where they had zero electricity for almost a year. And that system was on life support for a very long time until we supported the Bahamas in building a system that brought them 90% renewable energy, solar and battery. They were off the system for about 6 months before they had to do another purchase of fuel. And it's about on average 6 months before they do any purchases still today. So the system is working. It has given some technical challenges during the COVID period, but it's a fully functioning system that is working at full scale today. Next slide, please. Another system that we're working on is in the British Virgin Islands. This is still in the project de-risking phase. It's essentially a microgrid system that it supports hurricane shelter, which is a community college, and also a water treatment plant is in the area. There's a substation. We'll bring battery storage and solar to this facility so that in the event they get hit with another Hurricane Maria, this can be a sort of a central place for residents to go, and seek shelter and comfort. Next slide, please. I think that's it. I hope I didn't run too much over time. I was cutting it close there, but I'll open it up for any questions or thoughts that anyone may have.
Yeah, you did fantastic, David. Thank you very much. We've got a couple of questions surfacing in the chat box, and I invite everyone to also just boldly unmute and ask your question. David, you present so much context and in vivid examples what's going on in the ground, and I guess to me, I think we need to try to help the audience or participants today close the gap between where they're sitting now with their ventures and getting on the ground with partners. I'll start with, I guess, Mark's question, and it's about projects failing. Can you expand on why 90% of the projects fail in the project preparation phase, David?
Yeah, that's driven by a couple of factors, and I'll use my experience directly and explain it. I was the CEO of the Anglo Electricity Company back in 2015 when we were exploring our entrance into the renewable energy era. We started off with a 1 megawatt solar farm. It took about 4 or 5 years for us to get over the hurdles to make that happen. There are a couple of hurdles. One is knowledge, right? First of all, we had never done it before. It was completely new. So our teams had to learn as much as possible, not only with the technical expertise around solar. so that we could manage it and build it. But the process of procuring, the process of going through an evaluation process, a bidding process, getting all the support around that, we found it very challenging, and we're very conservative. So that took about 5 years. No, it didn't fail. We actually got it done. But I can tell you, not every company or resource, every entity has the willingness to do 5 years of work to work through that process, and to do it right. Okay. Now, do it right is your goal, but there's a lot of risk associated with that. The Caribbean Development Bank worked with us closely, helping us work through that, but that was a hurdle in itself. That took about 2 years to get the financing done. So it's just a tremendous hurdle that has to happen, and you have to overcome. We don't have that available capacity to make it happen, right? So there's a will, there isn't always the available capacity to make it happen, because there are a few hurdles that has to happen. So I wouldn't say it fails because of something that went wrong. It fails just because there isn't as much capacity.
Great, yeah. Okay, thank you, David. There's a couple of other questions, or a comment at least, that has emerged. And I know that I believe Ted is going to help us address some of the interconnection standard related questions. So we'll put those off to Ted's piece. But Yaron has made the comment that by using BESS for peak shaving, you can also prevent your utility bills from jumping due to crossing the maximum load threshold. And obviously the size of utility bill is pretty pivotal. So do you have any comment in that respect, David?
Yeah, I think it's right on, right?
Yeah.
In the Caribbean context, BESS, and that's part of the reason why RMI does the work it does in the Caribbean too, because it's a global proof point. When you work on a Caribbean grid, because they're small, you're dealing with all the challenges that come with integrating renewable energy almost immediately. So you'll have a small grid overall, but you'll even have a smaller feeder that you have to tie into to get the renewable distributed throughout the system. So you have a lot of limitations and a lot of impact that renewable brings to the system immediately. So that's another hurdle. That's a technical hurdle. But at the end of the day, where we were and the challenges we faced 5 years ago, we're no longer there. With battery storage and the capabilities that comes with not only the battery storage, but the inverter technology and advancements, all of these challenges are no longer as relevant. They still exist, but they're not as relevant. It can be managed and it can be monitored. So
yeah, that opens up important new opportunities for sure. David, question. This is a very broad question, and we don't have 45 minutes to answer it. But if you could quickly touch on a couple things about the typical technical, operational, as well as any regulatory interconnection challenges that you would talk about.
Yeah, it varies from island to island. I'd say if you look at Barbados, for example, where you have renewable energy as a right up to 10 kilowatt hours. They have a floodgate of applications to get connected to the grid. They do have a challenge of making that happen. So they're pursuing battery storage today. They have a fairly the regulatory environment there is fairly experienced because of all of the issues that they've been dealing with. So that's more advanced. And you'll have specific regulatory guidelines like in law, because they had to do that in order to get to the threshold that they are today. In other countries like Dominica or Anguilla, where they have very few systems connected, it's more ad hoc. In Anguilla, you can't connect a system, you can't grid tie for your own use. You can't do a larger community microgrid without regulatory sort of approval. But for a home use system, you can connect to the grid. So the regulations vary country to country. Most countries you can connect. I'll tell you this, it is a little bit of a hurdle because there's a little bit of a resistance on the utility side in many countries. So some are more laissez-faire, others are not.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, Dr. Jackson talked about the difficulties associated with harmonizing. I guess that is to the point. David, can you comment? I guess this is a question. I believe it came from Sapphire about how organizations go about engaging with the fund that is part of RMI. And has RMI helped structure the PPPs for the projects in the Caribbean through that fund or otherwise?
Yeah, I'm going to separate the fund into two parts. There's the project preparation, which is essentially the work that RMI does, supporting countries in advancing their projects. And then there's the investment part of it, which comes in after the fact when the project is bankable to fund that and other projects. The investment fund is not yet capitalized. That's going through the due diligence process right now. And kind of a couple of months of due diligence, but it's a fund that has sort of sister funds that have launched in Southeast Asia and Africa, but the Caribbean fund isn't quite there yet, and they're evaluating so more of the market risk associated with it. But there are a couple of investors that are doing the due diligence through the fund process right now. So it's still, I'd say maybe by the end of the year, it should be fully capitalized. And it's being capitalized in two tranches. One is 75 million, the first tranche, and then a second 75 million after that. So the application process will probably be published and come online early next year.
Okay, good news. That shows lots of promise, David. Thank you for that information. Question from Anouk: has Rocky Mountain Institute used any feasibility tools to predict performance of energy systems, David?
And I'm going to jump in, David, because I know that Mark Chidwick's question was coming from a place like, do you use software that can enter in all the technical parameters and the performance? What are the current costs of electricity, and what are the costs of that battery, solar? And I know Ted has done a bit on this too, but I just wanted to give Mark a little bit more of a in there.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just saying thanks, Anouk.
Yeah. Okay. We use, across RMI, we use a lot of different tools, but for the Caribbean context, we find Homer, because it's very island specific and microgrid specific, to be very useful. Plexos is another one that we use on more advanced or intricate systems. And then we just have a whole host of Excel modeling that we've used over the years, because we always find each island is a bit different. Yeah. And there are different factors that you can't account for in these models. They're just don't have that many variables. So we have to usually build a model to get sort of the basis and the foundation, and then tweak it based upon the reality of that island.
Yeah, so Enermetrics and Core would be good. These are their platforms are designed specifically for these micro situations and micro analysis. So we can look into that. Yeah.
Well, that was awesome, David. I appreciate it. And I appreciate if you can stay on for a few minutes. Perhaps we can, as some questions come up, you may be the best person to answer them.
I was happy to.
Andrea has left a comment about Core, her company, having microgrid predictive analytics to provide custom solutions. So any of the participants are welcome to reach out to Andrea today. You can see that that message in the chat box. And now I'd like to move to our next speaker, Ted Vogel. Ted's a renewable energy and sustainability professional based in Weaverville, North Carolina, United States. Ted's on today because he's a member of CAST, which stands for the Caribbean Alliance for Sustainable Tourism, and CHTA, which is the Caribbean Hotel and Tourism Association. So, and I know, Ted, you're keen to talk about interconnection standards as well. So we've allotted about 15 minutes of time for you to bring up those points and to hear from, I guess, the vantage point of the Caribbean hospitality sector. And where are you connecting in from today, Ted?
My office in Weaverville.
Oh, tremendous.
So, yeah.
Well, thank you for joining us.
Oh, no worries. It's great to be invited, and I was glad that Chris from RMI actually asked me to fill in for him today. So, if we can just go to the second slide. Okay, so I've been in the industry about 20 years. I started out with wind power in eastern part of North Carolina. We started out with a 50 kilowatt machine when I was doing installs, and we ended up with an Amazon wind farm. But I was on the front end of legislation, so bureaucratic things are near and dear to my heart. I did a bunch of work for the Defense Department in Afghanistan looking at hybrid operations. That was specifically wind, diesel, and battery. And I'm currently working in the Bahamas and Jamaica on aggregated funding projects, which actually rolls up into what we are hoping will be funded by the Caribbean Climate Smart Fund, and working with RMI on that to create a hospitality funding vehicle. CAST is an interesting group of people. We are a diverse group, everything from water use specialists, renewable energy, sustainability consultants, hotel general managers that sit as an advisory board to the Caribbean Hotel and Tourism Association. Part of what we do is help craft educational messages with around things like sargassum and Zika. We've got some world wildlife related matters that are coming along, and conservation network things that are coming along in this coming year that are going to help promote overall education in the community. But we have huge issues with energy, and we try and educate our members about that as well. They will be part of the funding programs and the promotional programs for CCSF if we move in that direction. Everything's pending at the moment. May I have the next slide, please? So the value of tourism is what I call where microgrids meet macro applications. People think of islands as whole systems, and some small islands actually are much more integral whole systems, and larger places like the Bahamas and Jamaica really don't hit any of those types of scenarios. They're countries or states in the United States sense unto themselves. But 45 to 60% of OpEx goes to pay for electricity. And underpinned within electricity is also water. Everybody's hostage to fuel surcharge and geopolitics. I don't know if you've noticed Eastern Europe over the last year and a half, but oil prices keep doing things like this whenever everybody gets mad over there. This impedes CapEx for improvement planning. And then you also have problems on some islands of peak stressed grids. So in Jamaica, they've actually asked hotels at varying times to turn their generators on when they can't supply a load with high use, high occupancy, and high air conditioning. So the question from a hotel's point of view is, can you island your property on your island? And truthfully, that's your mileage may vary. It was encouraging to hear David talk about some of the opportunities where you can do your own microgrids in smaller places. But regulatory structures, interconnection standards, and things like that will impact whether or not you can do that in a larger island. Or on a larger grid. And the other part of the problem is a lot of resorts don't have the space to do it. You just can't put out enough solar. And in wind, you have the problem of everybody, not everybody, but lots of people having a not in my backyard scenario. They don't want to look at a wind turbine. I'm not sure why they want to look at a diesel smokestack on a diesel gen plant, but it's all good. The key thing, though, is energy data precedes and predicates design. And this is even at a more micro level than David talking about power property planning. This is literally one node of one power grid that might feed into something larger like Ragged Island. You have your known knowns. You're paying for electricity. You're getting a usage bill. You have your known unknowns. Are you actually getting the amount of power that you're paying for? This is a problem with the US Virgin Islands from time to time. People are getting over and under billed. And then you have your energy costs versus your lost savings. And that is largely, can you act now on simpler things and move towards microgrids later? Next slide, please. So to me, the devil's in the microgrid details. You've got data questions. So are you getting what you're paying for? Are you hostage to single provider rules and costs? And how much can you do within the current rules? These are all things that you should understand as a baseline, in my opinion, as a property or a business looking to move towards renewables or microgrids in the Caribbean. So you need your bills. A lot of places don't have well, some islands are worse than others, but you have power quality, power frequency, power factor, and all of those types of things. So data logging is a good idea if you can get it done. This will not only verify that your electric bill is your electric bill, but it will also give you a power profile coming to your property. It'll give you time of day use. That is something that's helpful for anybody looking at renewables or renewables with any type of energy storage in the future. You also, through some simpler technology like hobo data loggers or proprietary data access off of newer refrigeration and HVAC systems specifically, get data on usage. So it gives you some ideas of what your property has and whether or not you're being efficient or inefficient. So back to the idea of microgridding your property. In the Caribbean, you probably can, but you might not be able to based on space. If you do, and this was specific to a project I was helping someone with on St. Lucia, Lucelec told them that if they microgridded their property and there was a hurricane, they would have absolutely zero support from Lucelec to fix anything that was broken. And they would not, if their system went completely down, they would not be reconnected to the grid at any priority. So you've got to understand those things to some extent. The other part of it is politically, you can push costs to others. Emerald Bay in the Bahamas put in a reverse osmosis water treatment plant. They were going to basically island themselves for water for the property. BPL asked them not to do that because it would push too much cost onto the properties near them and to the communities near them. So they struck a deal. So if you island yourself, all of your line service charges, all of your insurance, all of your monies that you pay to employ the local electrical workers for the power company, that gets pushed to your neighbors. And that's a political hot button. And then the other thing is you have monopolies in local governments, which is, well, if this was us having cocktails at 4 o'clock in the afternoon or 5 o'clock in the afternoon, I'd probably have more colorful comments, but it presents a massive problem. You have off-island monopolies, you have quasi-governmental power companies, you have governmental power companies. So the rules change every single island. You can't count on the scenarios being the same from island to island. But once you understand the rules, you can bend them, in my opinion, to your eventual desire to have a microgrid. And more importantly, you can bend them to saving energy money now and put that money aside and then maybe use it in the future to do more. So you can overproduce with energy on almost every single island. There's no rule, but there are rules on whether or not you can export to the grid. So if you have problems in exporting to the grid, then you might want to consider either batteries or ice storage is another huge cost saver because you can use it for refrigeration and HVAC. And then the other thing with rules, and this is the depressing part, is it's really expensive. Solar battery and software isn't cheap. That's the rule that you've got to go after. And you need to understand that. Data helps you understand your cost benefit and all of that. Next slide, please. So that may have been a little bit depressing, and it was also a lot in a small period of time. So I think I can give you some ideas that might help you feel optimistic. And this is my favorite cheesy acronym I've ever come up with. So to me, it's about baby steps. You've got a baseline and set goals. So you have to have your internal meetings. You have to understand where you are and where you want to be. You have to assess where you are. This is the key consideration. Whether you're looking at just putting in solar to save energy or whether you want to move to an eventual microgrid, you all have to start in the same place. Your roof health, your age of your current physical plant and your electrical infrastructure, your near-term renovation plans. This is huge. I've seen properties where they have great space for solar and they're like, no, we can't do that. We're putting 2 stories on that villa and we're changing the roof line. As a for instance, ground space is really expensive. So that creates a problem. And then the other thing that you need is a single line diagram, or the best thing you can do to get close to having a single line diagram. Beaches, Turks and Caicos was bought from another resort company by Sandals in the 90s, if I remember correctly. They've got 11 different transformers. They've got 3 different expansion plans, some of which were done before them. They don't have a comprehensive single line diagram for the property. So knowing that you can put solar here and you've got the wire size and the capacity and the switch gear that can handle it, you have to discover some of those things before you decide you're moving towards renewables or a microgrid. So after you get done with that, the first thing I would recommend is figure out where you can save energy first, enact efficiency programs. For instance, housekeeping should never leave a room without the thermostat being set to 72, as a for instance, because people will leave it on 64. They'll go to the beach all day and it'll cost you $3 literally for a room that's unoccupied. Add that to 1,000 rooms and you run into a bunch of money problems. So do your EE first, and your small renewables ideas first. And in that, you can look for in-country assets or off-island people. There is a great blend of both of those. You would be amazed how much you can get done in talking to people around Jamaica, but the smaller the island you get, and David referenced this as well, you run into issues where you might not have the local expertise, but your local power company is pretty smart. You do have local electric contractors, and you might be able to go one island away rather than Miami, Houston, or New York to find your solutions. So once you've figured out what you want to do and you have some idea of a pathway, you want to execute what you can afford to do. Low-hanging fruits always first. Do efficiency before you do solar. Do efficiency in solar maybe before you go full microgrid. So in order to do that, though, you will need to engage current and new partners in new ways. There are funding options. The Caribbean Climate Smart Fund is coming along. That I think is going to be a bit of a bellwether because it's something that's looking to go more direct to market rather than making a bunch of left turns. You have to consider your value-driven deliverables. What's the most important first? And the key thing to understand is the cost of waiting. You will lose money every day if you do not act. And in the realm of losing money every day without acting, if you could go to the next slide, this is what a 12-month, 200 kilowatt hour project would look like in Jamaica if it was effectively aggregated into a larger program. So some of the efforts that we're talking about with CHTA and RMI will create an aggregation program where we will be able to bundle, create a larger funding tranche that's more attractive to, blue chip investors and funds and things like that. But you have some poor assumptions in this. The interest rate for the lease would be high. The CapEx, the capital interest rate for the construction loan would be high. The cost per watt installed would be high. And it still comes out to 28 cents a kilowatt hour projected over a 12-year equipment lease. And this, to give you an idea, 200 kilowatts is a 110 to 130 room hotel. It would take care of most of their base load. But this is also theoretical. Your results may vary, but this gives you an idea of what could happen. Next slide, please. So the numbers game is a giant source of confusion. It confuses me, and I actually work in the industry, but I'm also a cost benefit analysis and more of like a PR and sales guy than I am engineering and all of that kind of stuff. From the point of view of what you need to learn, this is my advice, try and steer clear of things like cost per watt, roof mount, interconnection requirements, UL listed, smart inverters, bidirectional meters. The list goes on and on and on. What you want to do in your early discovery is get to life cycle cost of energy. So if I do 500 kilowatts of PV and X amount of batteries, and my kilowatt hour cost is going to be projected to be X what over time, that 28-cent kilowatt hour price for Jamaica is 11.5 cents under today's current retail. So the savings is there and it makes sense. Now, shrink the playing field is the next best step from my point of view. Know the data that you have. This is key. Know the data that you do not have, and then engage your local resources or your off-island expertise or imported SMEs to figure out what that means. Engage wherever you need to unpack better options. I would recommend steering clear of politics if at all possible, because it is a morass in many ways. And don't get me wrong, there are stunningly amazing people in island politics that are trying to move the ball in this direction. But as David mentioned, with Anguilla's project, it took them a couple of years to get to the point where they could get it off the ground. At least I think it was Anguilla. It might have been Ragged Island, but that's a hallmark. You can baby step this forward. You can do, Jamaica Inn, Kyle Mays, who's the director of CAST, he just signed a lease to do 65 kilowatts of PV on his property. Now, he doesn't have a microgrid. He's thinking maybe he wants to do batteries, but he's also looking at efficiency. So action can happen now. Building blocks can be laid now that will move you to the next step of eventually having some system hybridization. And from a hospitality standpoint, sheltering your emergency electrical circuits and backing those to batteries, putting your main refrigeration and backing those to batteries. If you have to have your own water treatment facility or water generation facility, backing those to batteries would be the three things I would look at. Because if your grid goes down and you lose $100,000 worth of frozen food, you not only have a loss of money, you also have a big stinky mess that you have to clean up at the same time. So, next slide, please. So, in closing, knowing the battlefield is all about knowing the rules. Mine the data that you have, find people to close your data gaps, determine the shortest path to the best savings scenario for you. And understand what you want to spend your money on. Most hotels are in a 3-year or under. Most hospitality facilities are in a 3-year or under simple ROI on the money that they want to spend. So if you can find financing that helps you with that equation, that's great. The lanes that I swim in, we look at projects being cash flow positive on day one. So there is accessible funding out there. And it's just a matter of sort of getting the team together to make the funding attractive to a large enough partner. And the other part is that we're all future looking, and I would love to have, high carbon using entities and countries figure out a way to offset carbon damage in places like the Caribbean. But if you have excess money and if you have savings, in my opinion, what that allows you to do is better speak, better educate, and better train the people to get the government aligned more with what you're trying to do. And ultimately, if you can make a statement of saying, I've reduced my carbon input, why can't you? It's leading by example. And it might be a little bit of shouting into the wind, but it is the best path forward, in my opinion. If you're going to be green from a dollar sense point of view, when you do projects like this, keep track of all of your wins along the way so you can quantify what that actual green means in any type of public procedure or public facing sides of things. And very quickly on interconnection, long story short, UL and CE listed items, one, designed to whatever standard the island adheres to. So for instance, the Bahamas tends to lean on the EU, and St. Kitts and Nevis, I believe, also the EU, but specifically France. Jamaica has a little bit of England and a little bit of the US mixed together. US Virgin Islands is the US. So normally, if you have things that you can do within your cadre of design and capability that meet the national standards of the country you are located in, then that will 75% of the time not have any problems transmitting to the local island. So.
Thank you, Ted. That's a whole series of great advice for us. Appreciate that.
No worries.
Just hang out for a couple minutes. There's a couple of questions for you. And just returning everyone's attention to that chat box. David Gums, thank you for your comment about geothermal and volcanic islands and the potential thereof for hydrogen production. There's a couple of links there in the chat box. David Ince, you had your hand up. Oh no, it's up again. So we'll get to David Ince first, and then we'll go to Mark. Mark Chidwick at Metrics had a couple of questions. Go ahead, David.
Yeah, I guess David and David. Thanks for that, David. Yeah, so many things to say. I mean, as I look at this, being here in Barbados at the moment. One of the things that's coming across to me a lot is, boy, we have to really improve a lot on the coordination and the discussion between islands and countries. Because although, as you're quite right, that every country is different, we've got to try to find a way to bring these things together so at least people have the combined learning. I mean, I even personally realized that I need to get to know some of the people here a bit more, because in terms of the work that I'm doing between the sort of Caribbean and Canadian link, I don't know if people know all of my background, but that's a consultancy. So having said all of that, CARICOM, we had looked at this project as being based around CARICOM. And as I sort of listened to the presentations today, I realized actually we've had quite a few interesting comments about countries outside of CARICOM. So
Sure.
it may be actually that the British overseas territories that David mentioned a lot, it hit me that maybe there are lessons to be learned there. I mean, even as I am talking to people here in Barbados, I can't say that they are very well aware of some of the things that we're talking about, and perhaps some of them could have been on the call today. But I guess that's just something we have to look at in terms of working together to be to just be a little bit clear that we all have all the information that we need. So that would be my main, I guess, question and comment would be to try to what in terms of you that have spoken before, what has been the link? Are you working with CARICOM or any? I just say CARICOM because that's probably the most well integrated group in there. We have C3 on the call as well. How much of these organizations been involved in it? Because it could have a little bit more than the sort of country to country discussion that we're having so far, which, as everybody is saying here, yes, there's so many arrangements, and all of my research says that. And also, I'd like to just end by saying the regulatory as well. Actually, I was smiling when David Gums was saying that, hey, Barbados is so mature and than some of the other islands and can get things done and stuff. But we actually are struggling here quite a bit, and I don't know that we see ourselves. I mean, I guess it's a compliment as that mature, because even with microgrids, I've been talking here. It's
For sure.
It's still a lot of push of I won't say pushback, but recognizing of the challenges with the regulatory system that we have here.
Right.
And I really do feel that we need to focus on that, because even though we've talked a lot about the technical capabilities and what kind of technology is available that can do things, without the regulatory structure, these things are not going to come. So I feel sometimes that we need to perhaps put the cart, we might put the cart before the horse in terms of looking at, okay, it's good to know that all these financial help and all of these capacity is out there, but before we get to that, we have to sort of get the countries on board of this is what is useful, this is what this is how we can proceed. And I think that talking here, I know it's going on a little bit, but I just thought that I should bring this up.
Oh, absolutely.
The resilience, and I think it's been looked at a lot, the equity, the resilience, that if that even that microgrids, yes, is an important part of it. But I think sometimes when you go and you start with, well, let's see what can happen with microgrids, people have sort of sometimes preconceived ideas about that and can sometimes withdraw a little bit. A lot of times you hear things like, well, we are so small as countries, why would we need a microgrid and so on? But I think if we can look at resilience as this is what we're talking about, because even in the presentations this morning or afternoon, depending where you are, it has not all been on microgrids specifically, but it has been on, sort of, to me, solutions that where microgrids are part, that can be part of the whole resilience and overall sustainable development. I think that's kind of how we need to push it in a way that, hey, here is something that can help innovation. Here is something that can help us go forward. So
okay,
I think
David,
just things that came. I know you probably
we're
have
going to move over
time,
to.
but
I think David.
But thanks for that. At least.
David Gums has a comment. David Gums, the other David has a comment for you, David, as well, and I think Ted may want to respond to that. Ted, you've also put a comment into the chat box. I appreciate that. The idea that Chris Burgess at RMI could unpack that whole question in the commentary. It's sparked lots of topics that could potentially be addressed. There's no question about that. Now, if in the interest of time, I'd like to get to Mark Chidwick's questions, and then we'll move over. I know we're pinching Nancy a little bit on the ESG side. So we can quickly, perhaps Ted and or David, if you could help us address the question around the regulatory issues. Are there regulatory issues that a hotel needs to deal with if their on-site energy systems are 100% behind meter and will never export? And just generally about building management systems, whether that enables the larger resort to generate the data that would be required for modeling.
So building management systems help dramatically in any type of modeling. So, I mean, Turks and Caicos, like I'm very familiar with Sandals from working with them. So Beaches, Turks and Caicos, they have 11 different transformers. Don't know how any of them are loaded because they're all under 1 meter, Atlantis, Bahamas, Paradise Island has 44 different meters and 65 transformers. So we can see how some of those transformers may be loaded. And the whole thing in Bahamas is you can only put 500 kilowatts per meter of any renewable. So understanding some of those things are great. If you're a smaller property, single meter, single transformer, it's a lot easier to understand. So there's those considerations. As far as regulatory issues with hotels exporting power to the grid, if you can shelter everything, it is my understanding there might be some capacity limits, like in the Bahamas. If you have 1 meter, you max out at 500 kilowatts, period. If that 500 kilowatts is overproducing for your property in the Bahamas, yes, you could put in batteries, you could shelter that, and you could burn those kilowatt hours at 9 o'clock at night versus 3 o'clock in the afternoon. There was a water to heat pump cooling situation equation.
Yep.
I'm not aware of companies that are actively doing that in the Caribbean. I'm not saying it does or does not work, but all I know is all the metal I ever see for HVAC systems really close to the ocean in the Caribbean tends to die 20 years sooner than it would if it was in New York City.
Okay. Yeah.
So, and David asked some great questions and had some bigger points across coordination. And David Gum and Chris Burgess have been on the leading edge of the ship. I won't quite say like Jack on the front of the Titanic or anything like that, but they've literally been point of the spear, traveling and sailing around the Caribbean, trying to deal with getting people on the same page. And there's been some noted successes in that, but it's taken time and it'll continue to take more time. But the industry is moving in that direction. Carolet, CARICOM, CTO, CHTA, there's a bunch of different entities across all of those spheres that they're trying to get themselves on the same page, and there's good people making that effort.
Yeah, it's so important to have that same page. And I see you see Andrea's comment about whether CARICOM could actually encompass more of the Caribbean islands. That would be a benefit too. It seems like she's founded quite an effective group or organization.
Yep.
Well, thank you for that. We'll move to Ted. That was tremendous, and it really provoked a lot of thoughts here. You can see we're going to move to Nancy Ferran now. Nancy's the founder of ESG Partners, and as mentioned at the top, calling in from Halifax, Nova Scotia today. Nancy's a CPA, a fellow in that profession, and a chartered director, and decades of relevant experience in terms of global sustainability standards and frameworks, and truly an authority on ESG. We're thrilled to have her. She's certainly got specific experience with regard to the Caribbean. We've asked Nancy to, there was an interesting question, I guess, in the pre-work, and got some interesting responses about people's general ESG preparedness for doing business in the Caribbean, as it's become a really central topic in the last couple of years. Therefore, we've asked Nancy to spend about 45 minutes, probably more like Nancy, a little bit less than 40 minutes, but close.
I'll go quickly.
Anyway. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and our intention is that Nancy, we'll work with Nancy after to follow up with getting some ESG related materials to all of you. But Nancy, go ahead.
Wonderful. Thank you. And if you could just give a thumbs up if you can see my screen without seeing a whole bunch of other screens. Okay, perfect. Okay, great. So I'll get right to it. Really happy to be here. Love all the conversation about what's going on in the Caribbean. I've had the absolute great fortune of being able to work in the region for about the last 15 to 20 years, just through a variety of other capacities, mostly related to capacity building, education, and the accounting profession, and working with organizations across the board and government. So really happy to be able to support what you guys are doing here. So getting right into it, when we talk about ESG, and Will had already alluded to this, some of you through your surveys, and again, they are anonymous, so I just saw them at the aggregate level, but there was a lot of familiarity with the term, a lot of familiarity, to various degrees in terms of what you're doing and being able to bring these efforts into your businesses. But I always do like to start with a solid footing so that we all know exactly what we're talking about and what we mean. We often talk about HR policies and whether or not they include diversity, equity, and inclusion, and increasingly whether they're also incorporating accessibility issues, workplace safety policies, supplier agreements, customer agreements, business partnership agreements, and increasingly in requests for proposals or funding. They are increasingly beginning to consider elements beyond the financial transactions or expectations. Companies are being asked about their performance in a variety of areas and what impacts companies are having or having put onto them that relate to broader issues around the environment and societal impacts. This is all ESG. So when we talk about ESG, we're just talking about environmental and social governance factors that can impact the long-term sustainability of a company and also the societal impact that it's having. In other words, these are the issues that could cause risks to your organization if they're not identified or managed, and also while providing opportunities for innovation and new business opportunities, which is a lot of what we've been talking about so far this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you are. So we talk about environmental issues. Those are those factors around climate change, energy management, emissions and biodiversity, social issues around labor practices, human rights, product safety, employee health and wellness, diversity and inclusion. And governance covers areas such as board oversight, risk management, ethics, compensation policies. So those things that forces the company's leadership and how it guides and directs the company to have a positive impact, or at the very least, to reduce its negative impact. 2020 saw a real acceleration in the investment community taking action towards sustainable or incorporating sustainability into their decision making. And in 2021, through one initiative alone, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, they were able to get commitment of $130 trillion US in private capital to transform the economy to net zero. This opened up tremendous opportunities for businesses to become part of the solution, while also creating new innovations and new industries. Last year, the US Inflationary Reduction Act, the climate bill, is continuing to drive historic climate action. This is the largest investment in clean energy and climate action that's ever been taken, and it's a transformative law that's helping the US meet its climate goals and to strengthen their energy security. Just looking at their report issued a couple of weeks ago, companies have announced over $110 billion US in clean manufacturing investments just in the last year alone. So it goes to show the amount of capital that's being put into these solutions, and that I'm sure is driving a lot of why everybody's here today around this call. But it is important to remember that the ESG risks that businesses are facing are for the most part unprecedented. And that means we can no longer look at the past to predict the future, and that makes it a game changer. So as a result, ESG and this conversation around ESG is increasingly becoming that lens that stakeholders are looking through to be able to help assess a business in terms of its longevity, in terms of the impacts it's having. So your business partners, your funders, your investors, potential customers, government, your employees, all of your stakeholders are really starting to look at these issues beyond just whether or not you financially are performing. And they're really looking to look at this more holistically. So stakeholders' perspectives will vary greatly, as will their degree of influence. But there's one commonality across the board, and I'm sure you're probably seeing it in the work that you do, is that the expectations from stakeholders are increasing and they're consistently changing. So it's a matter of getting ahead of it to make sure that you're not always in that reactionary mode. And that's why we talk about ESG. So this is important if you're a publicly traded company, through a micro size or small size enterprise, that's part of a larger supply chain. It's across the board as being so important. And just one last bit of sort of clarity. There was a time when the public stance on environmental, social, and governance issues was really focused around public relations, public outreach, or corporate social responsibility, or CSR. But in today's rapidly changing business climate, attention to ESG issues is becoming critical to long-term competitive success. And that's why we need measurable criteria and benchmarks. You know, I think it was Ted who was just talking about data and the importance of data, getting that baseline in place, being able to assess your performance and seeing how you're benchmarking against others is critical. And you need a framework or a set of standards to be able to do that in a common language, if you will. That's what ESG is getting us towards. When we talk about sustainability in that broader sense, we're talking about responsible business practices, human rights, environmental stewardship, health and safety. And we do actually have a way or a common language to talk about sustainability, and that's the Sustainable Development Goals. These are, I'm sure that all of you are very well aware of this. And to be honest, I find we talk about the Sustainable Development Goals far more outside of Canada than we do inside of Canada. And just in my work in the Caribbean, always hearing the SDGs come up in conversation in terms of how do we approach our biggest problems moving forward. So this provides a logical framework for ESG and does really help to address that interconnectedness between resource availability, human rights, and economic development. And I think that's really core to the conversation we're having here today when we talk about you know, energy and the energy transition and moving to a low carbon economy. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, I promise, especially where time is at a premium right now, but I did want to mention this because it's important. Even though the SDGs provide that general guide for sustainability action, we do have formal mechanisms in place to help us understand ESG and what is included and what isn't. And these are just a couple of the specific frameworks or standards that you'll often see tossed around whenever you're talking about environmental, social, and governance impacts. You know, whether they are stakeholder focused, investor focused, climate focused, these are all sort of core to the conversation. So I just mention this because increasingly your stakeholders are going to start to tie your performance, regardless of what size company you are, to these standards and some of the issues that they bring to light. And we will talk about them in a couple of minutes. So I'm not going to just leave you here and hanging, but I'll bring it back to how it matters in a second. So when we look at specific risks around ESG in the context of a business, when you think about increasing severe weather events and the damage that it can cause to your assets, or, you know, we heard as well about, you know, if there was a storm that knocked out solar panels on someone's roof, what would that do? You know, if you're a company and you're responsible for that, how do you get ahead of it? How do you ensure that you've got some resilience built into your overall value proposition as a business? And also weather events create supply chain disruptions. And if you're relying on supply chains beyond just your own sort of jurisdiction, this becomes very important. Also, a lack of regulatory compliance around social and employment issues can cost, you know, litigation fees or product or service delays, all those sorts of things. And ineffective governance pretty much speaks for itself. It's increasingly showing us that there is increased litigation, fines, and of course, reputational damage. And the cost of a company having its reputation impacted cannot be overstated. The smaller the organization is, the less insulation it has against some of these reputational impacts, and companies can lose their social license to operate because of their performance around environmental and social issues. So just really important to keep that in mind. And I hope I'm not going too quickly, but if I'm going too fast, please stop me or put something in the chat. I'm just trying to make up some time here. So I'm just going to show you a couple of examples about how this plays out with companies that you may have already heard about this. So Tesla had recently, last year, had been excluded from the S&P 500 ESG index. Their score didn't necessarily change that much, but its peers did better. So again, when you think about ESG from a competitive advantage standpoint, Tesla missed the boat on this. So the reason why Tesla ran into this problem is because they themselves did not have a low carbon strategy. Imagine that. So they also ran into issues around their code of business conduct. And in particular, they had 3 controversial issues centering around racial discrimination in the US plants. And on top of that, they also had well, they were called out for their handling of an investigation around multiple deaths that were linked to their autopilot functionality. This wider lens resulted in Tesla being dropped. The governance issue with respect to their CEO kind of came after the fact. So, so all of these issues definitely did come into play. Tesla felt very strongly that this decision to drop them from the ESG index ignored the real world impact of their technology and what they were doing. And many people absolutely agree with them. But at the same time, when you look at it from the other lens, it's companies have to be accountable for how they do what they do. It's not just about what they do, it's about how they do it. So in other words, it's not okay or it's not good enough anymore for companies to have the strong sense of purpose or for their product or service to be sort of purpose driven or purpose focused. It really is about going beyond that to demonstrate how these organizations are delivering on their promise. And in some cases, the organizations that do hold themselves out to a higher purpose, or to say that our technology performs this, sometimes they can often be held to even a higher standard because their product or service meets that sort of social need or environmental need. They've got to make sure how they're doing it makes sense too.
Nancy,
So
you're doing fantastic, by the way. Just wanted to jump in and say that. There was a question in the chat about valuing ESG. And I think what you're describing is valuing the consequences of not having ESG in place. But can you speak to that further before you move on?
I'm not sure I understand the question. What do you mean by valuing ESG? I'm not sure who put that in, but can you give me a little sense?
Is there a way to value ESG in real dollars? Has that been explored?
That's a multi-layered question. So if you look at, so you can look at ESG, so you're quite right. I mean, we look at it from quite often, what's the risk of not taking this seriously? What could be the risk of, how do you value the cost of a loss of life? Suncor, for example, last July had its 5th workplace fatality after already committing to having higher standards around employee health and safety. How do you value that? I'm sure the litigators will definitely put a price on that. At the same time, if you are a company that looked at the environmental impact of the oil and gas sector and you thought, I have a solution for carbon capture, so I'm going to work with that company to find a way to reduce emissions through my technology by embracing an opportunity. Again, that value is going to be the valuation of that company and what it can do. The carbon credit market is offering a way to value. So it's the approach. What ESG is, it's the approach to be able to assess the risks and the opportunities that are present from being able to look at how you prioritize certain environmental, social, and good governance priorities. So it's not just say, oh, ESG is worth X or it saves this. It really is about your approach to how you manage business. I'd like to come back and visit that question at the end of this to see if I've answered that question in a more holistic way. And if not, I'd love to have another conversation off to the side, if that's okay. Because I think it's a great question, because it kind of comes into like a lot of companies will ask, you know, why do we even bother doing this? And there's so many reasons. So I'd love to keep that dialogue going if we could.
Yeah, any related questions or other questions can go right in that chat box and we'll let you continue, Nancy. Thank you.
Perfect. No, thanks. And so, and this kind of, I guess, feeds into it. So in February, an environmental law firm called Client Earth, they were a shareholder of Shell. They notified Shell of its claim against the company's 13 executive and non-executive directors on their board. And they were arguing in this claim that they filed that the board did not exercise its fiduciary duties under English law because it failed to implement a climate strategy that truly aligns with the Paris Agreement, which is supposed to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. So if you think about that, because directors on boards can be held personally liable for their decisions on the companies, and normally that's why you have directors and officers liability insurance. But depending on how this plays out, we could see a real precedent being set in terms of the board's responsibility to oversee some of these issues. So big company issue, but it's going to have ripple effects depending on how it plays out in court. So we also look at two sides of one coin, risk and opportunity. So when you also look about ESG risks, they do present opportunities. So take those risk examples that we looked at before and start to turn them around. So by focusing on operational efficiency, it can result in water and energy savings, and also in opportunities in terms of energy solutions that can go to a broader sector, which is again why we're here. Addressing social and employment risks can result in growing your customer base, attracting top talent, creating new business partnerships because you're aligned from a cultural perspective. And effective governance, of course, can improve your risk management and overall revenue. So when you think about all these companies that you represent and that you work for and that you're here, and growing, these ESG risk examples and opportunities, and throughout your supply chain, they really do have real sort of tangible impacts. So if we take a step back and we look at this, effectively, the practice of ESG is essentially your own investment in the natural and social capital inputs that your business relies on. So every business relies on some form of resources, both human, financial, and from nature or what have you, whether they be raw materials, renewable resources, whatever. Over half of the world's GDP is moderately or highly dependent on nature and the services that nature provides. So think about that. That's over $44 trillion in economic value generation that's exposed to risk from nature loss. And so daily we're reminded of the risks that are associated with climate change, civil unrest, societal inequalities, and the ongoing uncertainties resulting from geopolitical instability. And businesses need to adapt if they're going to be able to continue operating without significant hiccups, as a sort of a mild way to put it. And recent years have really been demonstrating the importance of sustainability and ESG considerations in unprecedented ways. So when we think about the business case, when done well, ESG has the ability to create many benefits for companies. So kind of going back to that question about, like what's the dollar value attached to it? We talk about how it can improve financial performance, because if you're focused on energy and operational efficiencies, you can end up reducing costs through your operations and through your use of resources and reduce waste. And on the other extreme, by reducing or avoiding your exposure to catastrophic losses, predominantly caused by climate change, because you're going to be thinking about it, you're going to be planning for it, you're going to have resiliency plans in place. It can also help drive competitive advantage. Again, think about Tesla. They did not embrace this. They lost some competitive advantage because some of their stakeholders have decided not to necessarily engage with them in that same way. But also improves stakeholder engagement because you're looking at your stakeholders from a more holistic lens, fosters innovation, and builds customer loyalty. Helps to improve risk management because now you're proactively identifying and mitigating those operational risks that you don't necessarily see impacting your bottom financial line right now. So all of these ESG issues will end up becoming financial issues. They just tend to manifest themselves over a little bit of a longer period of time. So it's all about the planning and the embracing of these issues, which is why increasingly investors and lenders and other companies are caring about it. We talk about how ESG can also increase your access to capital. And the reason for that is by looking at all of your factors that make your company sustainable, from the financial through to the embracing of environmental and social priorities. It gives the impression, and I shouldn't say it in a way, in a way that's not valid, but it does definitely convey that message that your company is a lower perceived risk. Because you're looking at environmental and social issues from a longer term time horizon, you instantly become a little bit less risky as a business partner, as someone to do business with, or as someone to receive funds, either from a lending institution or an investor. So it really does enhance those relationships. And it also has the benefit of lowering the cost of that capital. And through that, of course, you're strengthening your brand and reputation and image, and allows you to open up new markets, strengthen new sales, and all of those wonderful benefits. And I'm not sure if everyone around this call is facing the same talent crunch, but it is becoming increasingly hard to find top talent, and there's a real competition for employees. And by being able to really lean into this, you're able to get employee loyalty in their engagement and productivity because they're seeing a real alignment with the values that this brings forward. So expecting that many companies around here are small, medium-sized organizations. When we say that SMEs are the backbone of our economies and societies, we're not kidding. The stats really back that up. And this is both provincially, nationally, regionally, and globally. And while the challenges that SMEs face may be unprecedented, so are the opportunities. SMEs are in such a perfect position to be able to move quickly and make decisions around their strategies. They're relatively close with their staff, their business partners, their customers, and all their other stakeholders, which allows for a deeper understanding of everyone's needs, so adjustments can be made accordingly. And increasingly, these issues that are top of mind are centering around environmental concerns and social concerns. We're seeing this expand into exporting, supply chains, investment, and funding, because they are increasingly becoming those areas that are looking for ESG considerations through their decision-making processes. So when we think about it from an exporting perspective, SMEs are present in the value chains, directly, or because they're part of larger corporations' value chains. So what ends up happening is if an SME is part of a larger value chain, it can impact the ESG metrics of those larger corporations who are taking this to a much higher level because their investors are demanding it. So what's happening is a lot of SMEs are being asked to supply ESG status or ESG information further up their supply chain. I'm actually working with one private employee-owned company right now, and one of their major customers, this was back in June, their customer came out and said, we want you to start reporting on your greenhouse gas emissions, and we need the information in 3 weeks. They didn't have it. We just started working together. So it goes to show that they had very little time to be able to really wrap their arms around this and come up with a strategy. Luckily, we're already working with them, but had we not been, that would have really caught them off guard and potentially could have jeopardized that relationship. I'm also working with another startup right now in the ocean sector, and they're working towards their Series A towards the end of the month. And they already knew that ESG was going to be an important element in their success to be able to receive the investment that they needed to allow them to scale. So they built ESG metrics into their sort of DNA, if you will, now, so that they could scale moving forward. Because investment and financing decisions are increasingly being linked to information on ESG information and status. We heard from the lady representing EDC this, just earlier in this webinar, and she said that all of their decisions will incorporate some element of ESG, whether it be from internal, the way that they operate internally, or the decisions they make on the companies that they work with. Also, RFPs with government and private entities are asking for ESG metrics in their application processes. And we're also seeing regulations in international markets tying back to ESG and sustainability related issues. I think it might have been Ted who was talking a little bit about Europe and how Europe and the Caribbean very closely tied together in certain countries. And the EU is leading the way in terms of sustainability and ESG metrics and the measurement of that. So basically any company that's a weak link in this value chain will be replaced. And we're seeing that time and time again. When we talk about supply chains, since the pandemic, we're continuing to experience supply chain disruptions, and it's been exacerbated by extreme weather events, social unrest, and geopolitical instability. It's disrupting the flow of goods, it's extending delivery times, it's forcing increased cost, and it's impacting customer satisfaction and business partnerships and relationships. So when you think about the supply chains that you might be engaged in, what are the potential risks to your businesses? Are you able to get a reliable workforce to meet your obligations locally and in the other markets that you're serving? So we're here talking about Canada and the Caribbean. How could some of these issues around climate and societal issues start to impact your ability to be able to engage across borders? Who do you partner with? What labor practices are they using? companies are being held accountable to that throughout all of their value chains. The way you engage with Indigenous communities and other communities. Regulations, how might those trip you up? What are the fines and penalties that are coming down the pipe? Not impacting anybody here, but just in Canada alone, we know that starting in January of 2024, all companies of a certain size and revenue and asset base, they need to report on how they're ensuring that they are addressing the risk of forced labor and child labor within their supply chains. Failure to do so will result in a $250,000 fine. These things are really coming to play and they're being enforced and they're putting some real force behind it. So investors and your supply chains and your business partners are going to start asking a lot of these questions. I'm going to go through this quite quickly, but when we talk about, again, investors in ESG, access to capital is one of the main things that ESG is being tied to. The more risks that can be identified through ESG metrics, the harder it will be to secure that financing or that investing. This is why investors won't even consider an opportunity. And quite a few, I know BDC as sort of, the entrepreneur's bank in Canada, we hear a lot, they tend not to even consider an opportunity without some sort of form of an ESG assessment or strategy built into it. 75% of private equity firms have walked away from investment that raise ESG red flags. And over 50% of private equity firms use ESG criteria in their search for investment opportunities. Private equity and venture capital seek relationships that achieve long-term multi-stakeholder value. And that's where this whole conversation really comes together, working together to share an understanding of a framework to be able to measure and evaluate environmental, social, and governance issues to create a mutual benefit to showcase that there is going to be real sustainable value moving forward. And a big piece of doing this is to stay ahead of the regulations for commercial advantage. Again, I pull back to that Tesla example. Tesla fell short of meeting its stakeholder expectations in terms of its own climate strategy and how it treated the people that it relied on. And other companies can take a share of that space. And European firms are definitely leading the way in adopting ESG in their practices. So again, I've mentioned this before, but RFP processes within the government are asking a lot more questions about ESG related issues. BDC has very detailed guidance related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and ESG issues more broadly. And as we just heard, EDC is prioritizing ESG in their own operations and business or decision-making around the companies they wish to engage with. We're also starting to see lending institutions, so banks, looking to incorporate ESG into their lending practices, sometimes offering lower rates if a company has an ESG strategy, sometimes offering or putting in penalties if they don't. So we're going to see more of this coming to pass for sure. So now take it forward and start thinking about how can you start to think about this directly. Again, hopefully being able to answer that question about, the cost of doing this or the financial benefit of doing this. So we've just talked a lot about how ESG could affect your business, but how do you actually go about starting to think about it? Now, I will start by saying there will be resources coming out to you next week in terms of how do you start, and give us some toolkits, like a toolkit, if you will, with all the key areas in it. And that'll be coming next week. But to start thinking about what impacts your company may cause through their direct actions and business activities. And sometimes it's those unintended consequences as well that you've got to keep in mind. And then what are those other pieces that you could contribute to by being in business? Or through your activities. And those don't need to be negative, they can be very positive as well. So how are you contributing to the energy transition, for example? And what are those areas where you could be affected by in terms of your ability to meet your own strategic priorities because of things either those things that you do or those areas that you can't control and can't predict, like climate change impacts, disruptions to operations and supply chains, and again, increasing regulation in both Canada, the Caribbean, and in other markets like the EU and in even Asia, where ESG regulations are much more further ahead than what we're seeing here. So when you start to assess the impact areas and then start to prioritize them, really look at what topics or issues in that environmental and social and governance pillars are most relevant for your company. What offer the greatest risks to your operations and your reputation and your financial output, and then what offers the greatest opportunity in terms of innovation, new products, business partnerships, government partnerships, those sorts of things. So, for example, consider how reduced rainfall or changes in rainfall patterns may impact your technologies or your solutions. What about hotter summers and increases in wildfires, rising sea levels and increased storm volatility that leads to shoreline degradation and asset impairment? Those are the issues that may affect your businesses based on, the survey results and based on the industry that you're in. There are many social priorities that are driving government agendas, and while also offering opportunities for innovation. For example, I was just last November, I was invited to the Barbados Chamber of Commerce luncheon with Prime Minister Mia Mottley, and she talked a lot about affordable housing being a massive priority for the government of Barbados right now. And it's actually formed part of the Barbados Economic Recovery and Transformation, or BERT, agenda. Innovative thinking around incenting homeowners to put solar panels on their roofs to make housing more affordable while addressing the energy challenge, and for land to be provided to build a home under a contract that comes with renewable energy being able to be incorporated back into the grid. That's a way to be able to make homes and land more affordable. I know Ted talked a lot about how there's a lot of challenges there. This all helps to get it, while leading to social equity, housing, and a resilient climate strategy and the energy transition. I mentioned earlier about standards, not going to spend a lot of time, but this gives you a sense of how does the rubber hit the road? So if you were starting to look at what are the issues, put this into context for me. What are the issues? Well, if we go back to those standards I talked about earlier, these SASB standards, they have identified 77 industries. So if I think about what industries would most of you probably fall into, one of them would be renewable resources and alternate energy for solar technology and project developers. So what these issues are that are listed here, these are the issues that investors and many other stakeholders have said through great consultation over many years that they care about, because these issues are seen as the ones that pose risk to your business, but also provide opportunities for competitive advantage. So I'm not going to go through them, just trying to save some time. I'm sure you can see them there. But what happens is these standards say, if you're not paying attention to these issues, you're posing a risk to yourself and to your investors and to your lenders and to your business partners. So look at these. And these standards also go so far as to provide information on how to track and measure these issues. Data and getting the data to support it is always going to be the challenge. But once you know what you need to measure, then you can start putting some metrics in place to be able to start the process. If we then look at the same thing, but looking at wind, there's a lot of alignment, but you'll see that the key topics that these broader stakeholder groups have identified are slightly different, looking a little bit towards workforce health and safety, ecological impacts, and the project development, product design on life cycle, material sourcing, and efficiencies. So the issues are slightly different than the solar, but there's definite alignment. And this is not to suggest that you can ignore everything else that may affect your business, but they just help you get started on thinking about what are those issues that your stakeholders care most about. And that's where these pieces kind of help. In a Caribbean context, I'm almost done. I only have a couple of more slides, so hopefully I'm doing okay for time as I looked well. If we look at this from a Caribbean context, the ESG priorities in the Caribbean can vary and absolutely do vary from one country to another. And that's due to difference in economic development, environmental challenges, social issues. But there's several common ESG priority areas that are important pretty much across the board. So climate change and environmental consideration, mitigating the impacts of climate change, including rising sea levels, increased power of hurricanes and extreme weather events, protecting and preserving marine ecosystems, promoting sustainable agriculture and forestry, and transitioning to clean and renewable energy sources to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We also have biodiversity and conservation. So protecting and conserving the region's unique biodiversity and promoting sustainable tourism practices that minimize the negative impact on these natural ecosystems. Social equity and inclusion. And again, Prime Minister Mia Mottley talked about this at great length at that session that I was at last year. Addressing income inequality and promoting economic opportunities for marginalized communities and for all citizens. Improving access to education and healthcare, fostering social cohesion and inclusivity by reducing discrimination and promoting diversity, and enhancing disaster preparedness and responses to, across the board, but particularly to vulnerable populations during natural disasters. Governance and transparency to make sure that there is good practices around, just accountability, regulatory frameworks to support sustainable development, and ensuring transparency in government decision-making. Infrastructure development to make sure it's resilient and it can withstand the impacts of climate change. Sustainable agriculture and fisheries, renewable energy and energy efficiency, which I'm sure is of most concern. So increasing the use of renewable energy sources like wind and solar power, implementing energy efficiency measures in industries, buildings, and transportation, and reducing the dependence on fossil fuels and promoting energy diversification. And that is a theme you hear consistently. And resilience and disaster preparedness, of course, and strengthening those early warning systems and community preparedness. So it's important to note that while these ESG priorities are relevant to many Caribbean nations, each country will prioritize them differently based on their unique circumstances, and they will need to collaborate. I wish the gentleman talked about CARICOM. I wish CARICOM had a little bit more teeth in the region. Having worked with one of the other regulatory bodies, it's challenged to get that real clout, but I think it could be such a tremendous opportunity. And then finally, in that regulatory landscape, there was a lot of talk already about regulatory, especially as it relates to, to the industry itself. But if we sort of take a step back and we think about how did the regulatory changes maybe affect the ESG priority areas and your prioritization of it, corporate governance and reporting is coming to light in many Caribbean countries where governments are either considering or currently implementing regulation that require companies to disclose ESG related information. And so if you are supplying to any organization or part of any broader conversation, if you don't have the ability to disclose certain information or to track it, then again, you could be at risk of being replaced by a company who can. These are real issues. It's not to scare anyone, but real issues that are coming to the forefront. So being able to include detail on your environmental impact, social responsibility, and governance practices to improve transparency and accountability. I was just in Grenada, actually in June, for the Caribbean-wide Accounting Conference, and I was speaking on a couple of different topics, but all related to ESG. And I was part of a fireside chat. And to say that there is inconsistency across the region and how companies and people are going about this, that'd be an understatement. But again, very important and very much top of mind, and absolutely a key issue that came whenever we talk about sustainable development. It goes right to ESG pretty quickly, for the reasons that I had mentioned at the beginning of this presentation. Sustainable finance and investment is important because some Caribbean nations are exploring or adopting regulations to promote sustainable finance and investment practices. There's a lot of different funds, but green bonds, impact investing, and social responsible investment funds. And regulatory changes in this area could incentivize investments in ESG-friendly projects and companies who support them. Tremendous opportunity for the renewable energy sector. Climate change mitigation. Many Caribbean countries are facing significant climate change related challenges like rising sea levels, extreme weather events, as we talked about before. So regulations to address these issues are coming into force related to emission reduction, energy efficiency, and adaptation strategies. Again, tremendous opportunity for this energy sector. And just as an aside, I keep coming back to Mia Mottley, but I do have such respect for this woman, Prime Minister of Barbados. But if you haven't yet listened to her address to the United Nations in 2021 at COP26 in Glasgow, I strongly encourage you to do so. She speaks so passionately about the issues facing small island developing states in terms of the disproportionate impact of climate change on them and how that will start driving regulation around the region. So really, it's a really great 8 minutes, well spent for sure. And then natural resource management and regulations to make sure that the natural capital and natural resources are protected. Social and labor standards, that's definitely getting top billing and top of mind in terms of how do we address minimum wage, workplace safety, fair employment practices, domestically and across the board. Renewable energy and energy efficiency, with some Caribbean countries enacting regulation to promote the use of renewable energy sources to improve efficiency. And then finally, social inclusion. Inclusivity, social equity, they're all areas of concern, and there's a lot of work to go in towards addressing these issues around discrimination and to promote education and healthcare across the board. So I'm going really quickly, but to recap, this is an iterative process. It's evolving. It will continue to evolve for the short to medium term for sure. But some final thoughts. When you start to wrap your head around how do I even begin to demonstrate to those businesses I want to partner with, or those governments that I want to support what I'm doing, or to be able to move forward on various initiatives, how do I start to prioritize and show that I am focused on more than just making money, that it is about the how as opposed to the what? Start to identify those impact areas and prioritizing. You can't do it all, and resource constraints are real. So what topics and issues are most relevant for your company and to those companies that you want to do business with? What are the greatest risks to your operations and your reputation and your ability to meet impending regulation? And what would impact your bottom line? And what offers the greatest opportunity in terms of innovation, products, and those important business and government partnerships? Do your research, get your head around that, and be able to identify some of those key issues. Because by saying that we support a transition to a low carbon economy, or we're producing, energy that is, that will allow us to achieve net zero, that's fantastic. But how are you doing it, and how are you using those resources? How are you engaging in your supply chain, and how are you engaging with that society, communities, and the people who are helping to get you there? That's equally as important.
Right.
And then rank the ESG issues. You can't do it all. Focus on 2 or 3 issues per pillar, and that's it. So thank you.
Nancy.
I went quickly, but you know how to get hold of me.
I know you've really demonstrated the power of focus, haven't you? And then that's what's required to be successful in the Caribbean. If you look at all these companies that are listening in today, many of them have de facto ESG solutions that they can deliver to the Caribbean. So it's great to see that. If you could, Nancy, if you could put that information about Mia Motley in the chat box, I think it would be beneficial. If you could just refer us to where we might find that 8-minute presentation. And Anouk, you had a question?
Yeah, thank you so much, Nancy. That was amazing and very well structured and easy to understand and pick up on things. Sometimes I find that, in the busyness of people's everydays, and a lot of people, especially a lot of our members actually, are naturally aligned to ESG goals and SDG goals, and that's kind of their reason for being. But are there some popular kind of narratives or stories or tales that you like to tell about how, do you have any examples in mind where a company was like, yeah, ESG, it's not going to change anything about my company. It's not going to do anything for me. In your experience, are there a couple of examples that pop up in your head and say, well, I actually worked with this one company, a startup would be an interesting one to hone in on and say, and, they were getting some traction, but it really wasn't working until they started to really communicate in very visual terms that, by reducing emissions, increasing efficiency, and by diversifying our team, it's hard what I'm trying to say, but these are actual things that happened that made the gates open for us, and it just took our company to the next level.
Yeah, well, go ahead, Nancy.
So there's one company I can think of, and sort of almost on the reverse. So one company was that I just finished, again, startup, small company. They're based in Nova Scotia, but they do have a team in Ottawa, and they work along a bunch of different coastlines. and they're creating a technology to help increase the ability for oceans to absorb carbon. And again, purpose, like who could say that their purpose isn't absolutely incredible? However, they didn't predict the backlash or the resistance they would get from some of these community-based groups in certain jurisdictions, because they saw this as being too risky. You're going to hurt our oceans, and they faced protests, which resulted in some government delays and interventions. And so because of that, they didn't have the ability to find out what are the issues that your stakeholders care about. Did you look at some of the stuff? What did you do? When we worked with them, we were able to sort of go backwards and say, oh, I didn't think about that, or oh, had I known, or oh, how could I be more transparent? So that was one example. Another company that I was working with, they're a bit bigger, but they're still considered a startup. They were publicly traded, but they went about it through a different means to do so. And emerging technologies that at their core is sustainability. And they were focused on their investor and being able to meet the needs of the investors from an information reporting perspective. But as we started to engage internally with their stakeholders, we realized a number of issues started to come to the forefront, like energy and consistency of energy availability in one of their sites that they were actually scaling up for more manufacturing. They had no idea that they ran into these challenges because no one ever sat and asked the question or prioritized the issue in that way. They didn't realize they weren't going to meet regulations around language use in some of their jurisdictions. And they were also looking at scaling up there, so they didn't have the policies in place. So these sorts of things kind of came back to get them. And then also another company I was working with, they were trying to get some support through BDC, as they were, small startup, and BDC said, we don't want to talk to you because you don't have any ESG strategy at all. So when you do, come and talk to us. So it's all of these little nuggets are all over the place, but more and more it again, even if a company has none of that, increasingly you're going to find that the larger companies are going to say, if you don't, we don't want to work with you anymore because you're affecting us, right? And it's all percolating up. So quite often large pension funds, they need to care about this stuff because their investors care about this stuff, right?
Right.
So I don't know if that
Nancy,
answers your question, but those are some examples. Yeah.
David Gums appreciates and commiserates, I believe, your views about Mia Motley. And
she's wonderful. When I was sitting at lunch and she was right there, I felt like I was in front of the biggest superstar of my life. It was
I wish we could get her there for the forum in November.
I can ask the question. She's definitely passionate.
Yeah. And one of our other speakers today, Ted, has a question from your perspective, Nancy, as a chartered accountant. Are there standard, quote unquote, standard data scenarios for tracking green energy and energy efficiency metrics in kilowatt hour reduction, carbon offset?
Yeah, so there are, like, the standards go right down to when you're measuring energy use, when you're measuring greenhouse gas emissions, there are very clear guidelines around what you're measuring, how you're measuring, and what you're converting it to. So especially, greenhouse gas emissions all go to CO2 equivalents. And with energy efficiency, yeah, you're very right. It does come down to kilowatt hours. Yeah. So it's the standards go right down to that level of minutia. And I'd be very happy to share it with you because I quite enjoy that stuff.
All right.
So I shouldn't admit it, but yeah.
Nancy, we love that you enjoy it.
Someone has to.
And we're so happy that you're going to share. You got a bit of a toolkit on the way, right? Something like that?
Yeah.
Okay. So we're looking forward to that as well. Just going to move to a couple of closing comments now. It's clear, and we'll finish with Anouk in a minute or two here, but it's certainly clear for me today and yesterday in our B2B session and through the discussions we've had with RMI and CAST that the Caribbean island nations experience a number of significant energy issues, and we heard about a few of them today. Certainly the cost of energy is significant. Aging infrastructure, heavy reliance, that sense of being out of control, and the uncertainty around financing, plus this fragmentation that exists in the Caribbean. Independent thinking, trust levels, different energy mixes, regulations, and both the Davids who spoke today underlined that situation. Fortunately, it looks like, all these needs and challenges marry extremely well with the benefits promised by microgrid. The control of the value chain, predictability, low operating costs, redundancy, storage to address intermittency, and intelligent use of data. So it's a really nice marriage in that respect. We learned from the survey that microgrid suppliers in Canada certainly feel they have applicability to a few of the sectors in the Caribbean. It's still clear that they're going to face challenges, and Nancy, you brought up training and personnel. Certainly that's the case. It was mentioned by some of the respondents to the survey. And then predominantly the channels, the partners, the connections that they need in addition to their ESG preparedness. So those are all real challenges. And, you know, Claudia's a Trade Commissioner Service and Tamara's EDC presentations have begun to help us address that. And yours certainly went a long way, Nancy, to help us in that respect too. But just to recap, and before I hand over to Anouk here, you know, Dr. Gary Jackson from CCRE said in a recent presentation that he believes the Caribbean requires an entire reconfiguration in energy systems and infrastructure. And he's talking about billions of dollars to achieve that. So if you twin that sort of imperative with the imperative of the effects of climate change currently, and then the imperative to lower emissions quickly, and then if you look at the sheer abundance of energy in the Caribbean in terms of, you know, wind sources, solar sources, geo sources, hydro sources, that's got to mean huge opportunity for Canadian companies and an opportunity path over at least the next decade. Just to finish up here, we were lucky enough to get comments from the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center. And the comment there, if you're a supplier, you should take note of these things. The supplier must have a good reputation, a track record in designing, implementing, and maintaining microgrid systems. The supplier should offer cutting edge and reliable technology for microgrid components. Suppliers should be able to provide a full range of services that can tailor the microgrid solution to meet our unique energy needs and put in provisions for future expansion. The supplier must also be financially stable to ensure that they can complete the project and provide long-term support. So I know that there's organizations on the meeting and session today who fits that description. And I guess the rest of this program, if so, will be of high interest to you. Anouk, would you kind of detail for us what's coming up in this program and make some final comments before we sign off?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you, Will. We've got next steps. First of all, we want to get this microgrid market overview report circulated, and the video that RWI Run With It Synthetics is doing for us, which is a geospatial simulation of some of the highlights of the microgrid market overview. So we just have a couple of administrative things to do there before we can launch that. And I think it's got some rich, interesting, accurate information. Data is always an issue. Access to reliable, credible data, and figuring out what your sources are. So we've done a bit of validation of data. We put a lot of work into it, and I'm quite happy with the report. So we will send that out. The business to business yesterday, Will is going to do, quite a few of you were on that. Some of you weren't, but you might have submitted some interest in who you'd like to meet and network with. So if you haven't sent that to Will or myself or Crystal, and there are people that you want to meet either from yesterday and you want to have follow-up conversations, or from today, please let us know. And Will's going to be working on more of a one-to-one facilitation on that matchmaking. If you are in the Caribbean and you're interested in coming to Lake Louise in November 6th and 7th, to hear a very diverse group. We've got Rethinking Natural Resources, people from all over the world, the UK, the Netherlands, Mexico, the US, perhaps Australia. Hopefully we have and so we want to build this cohort of Caribbean representatives. So if you have an interest in joining that forum, as I said, we have some subsidies available to help cover airfare and accommodation, partially, not all of it, but a pretty good deal for being in Chateau Lake Louise, which is one of the 7 wonders of the world. So if you are interested, reach out and let us know. We'll have Rethinking Natural Resources, the rise of the prosumer and the role of the prosumer, things on workforce. We always have a session that's honed in on what's happening in our workforce and the transformations and the challenges. along with curriculum from universities and colleges and how there's a bit of a gap there. So there's very interesting and lots of fabulous networking. You'll meet amazing people and you'll come away with a much bigger, broader perspective on the latest innovations in energy systems. And I can guarantee it'll be highly relevant. And then again, if you're a Canadian company interested, I think Core Energy and Enermetrics, reach out to Ted and start that dialogue and David Gumbs and start talking to them about potential collaboration, but also we will have subsidies, airfare and hotel subsidies to partially offset the trade mission to the Caribbean in March 2024. So if you're interested in that, please let us know about that. And I think that's it, Will. I think it's been a fabulous session. We've had good representation from a diverse group of stakeholders from Canada and the Caribbean, and really good conversation. I've enjoyed it, and I think it's quality content and quality. We've had some good feedback behind the scenes and on the chat, so really happy about today.
Great, thank you so much, Anouk. And with that, we'll sign off for the day. I hope you got something out of it today, and please give us any feedback that you may want to put into the chat or email to either Anouk or myself. Again, thanks to all the speakers. It was quite an edifying session, at least I'll speak for myself, and I hope it was for the rest of you. And Anouk, these are really exciting events coming up, so I think we can add a lot of support to them, and great to see the interaction that is still to come. Thanks all.
Great.
Thank you.
See you.
Bye-bye.